This move opens lines for the queen and king's bishop, immediately fighting for central space and preparing to develop pieces rapidly. This move, 1, circa 5, initiates the Sicilian defense, a sharp and unbalanced opening that immediately fights for central space by challenging white's e4 pawn with a flank pawn. This move develops a knight towards the center and prepares to challenge black's central pawn. Control, a standard and flexible approach within the Sicilian defense framework. This move transitions into the French defense, a solid and strategic opening characterized by a closed pawn structure where black aims to undermine white's central control. This move initiates the main lines of the French defense, immediately challenging black's pawn center and aiming for an open position with dynamic play. This move transposes into the advance variation of the French defense, where white aims for a space advantage and black seeks to counterplay on the queenside. This move recaptures the pawn in the center, establishing a strong knight presence and opening lines for white's pieces in a standard variation of the Alpine Sicilian. This move initiates the classical variation of the Sicilian defense, aiming to develop a piece actively while preparing to challenge white's central pawn presence. This move, 5, nb5, is a common continuation in the accelerated dragon Sicilian, directly attacking black's c7 pawn and forcing them to address the immediate threat, often leading to the Maroshi bind structure if white plays c4 later. This move prepares to challenge white's advanced knight on b5 and aims to develop the bishop to a more active square, typically d7. This move reinforces the knight on b5 and prepares to develop the queen's bishop to a more active square, aiming to control key central squares and create a solid pawn structure. This move, developing the knight to f6, prepares to castle and also challenges white's central pawn presence, a typical response in the open Sicilian. This move develops the knight to a natural square, reinforcing the central control and preparing for castling while maintaining flexibility regarding the development of the queen's bishop. This move, 7, a6, challenges white's knight on b5, aiming to gain time and potentially disrupt white's development or force a favorable exchange. This move repositions the knight from the more aggressive b5 outpost to a3, aiming to avoid the immediate pawn tempo loss from a6 and potentially redeploy to c4 or b5 later, while also freeing the c3 knight. This move develops a piece and prepares to castle, reinforcing the central dark squares and allowing the queen to move if necessary. This move develops the bishop to a natural square, preparing to castle kingside and supporting the pawn on c4. Castling kingside solidifies the king and prepares to connect the rooks, a standard and safe maneuver in this variation of the open Sicilian. Castling kingside solidifies the king's safety and prepares to connect the rooks for future central control and potential action on the open files. This move initiates the challenging Neo-Grunfeld structure, aiming to control the d5 square and prepare for a queenside pawn expansion. This move prepares to develop the bishop to a more active diagonal while also reinforcing the center and potentially supporting a future f4 advance. This move develops the bishop to a good diagonal, preparing to control the center and support the eventual d5 pawn push, a common theme in this variation of the Sicilian defense. This move exerts pressure on black's queenside and prepares to support a potential advance of the b-pawn, aiming to gain space and control key squares. This move prepares to reroute the knight to a more active square, likely f6, to contest white's central control and support potential pawn breaks. This move prepares to activate the rook on the d-file, aiming to pressure black's central pawn structure and support potential d5 advances. This move repositions the knight to a more central square, eyeing the d3 pawn and potentially preparing to challenge white's control of the d-file. The queen repositions to c2, reinforcing the d4 pawn while preparing to potentially shift to the kingside or support a queenside pawn advance. This move prepares to challenge white's powerful light-squared bishop on e3 and seeks to exchange it, thereby easing black's queenside pressure and potentially opening lines for black's own pieces. This move prepares to contest the open c-file, aiming to exert pressure on black's queenside and potentially create attacking chances. The bishop repositions to e5, actively contesting the central diagonal and preparing to potentially trade off white's active knight on c3 if it ventures further into black's territory. This move appears to be a strategic repositioning of the knight to a more active square, potentially preparing to reinforce the kingside or support a central pawn advance, while also clearing the way for the queen to potentially shift its influence. This move activates the queen aggressively, eyeing the kingside and potentially preparing for a pawn storm with g5, though it risks overextension if black cannot adequately support this initiative. This move 17. G3 is a crucial defensive maneuver to prevent black's queen from infiltrating further into white's position on the kingside and to create an escape square for the king on g2 if necessary. This move aims to reposition the queen to a more active square, supporting potential pawn breaks or tactical operations on the kingside while also preparing for the d5 advance. This move aggressively challenges black's central influence and opens lines for white's pieces, aiming to seize the initiative in the Sicilian defense. This move challenges white's central pawn by offering a trade of bishops, aiming to open lines and potentially create weaknesses in white's pawn structure while activating black's pieces. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially preparing to support a kingside pawn storm or redeploy to a different part of the board, while avoiding immediate threats and keeping options open. This pawn thrust 19. e5 aims to challenge white's central pawn majority and open lines for black's pieces, particularly the bishop on b7 and the knight on c5. This knight outpost move challenges black's central control and aims to trade off white's potentially weak d-pawn for black's active bishop. This move retreats the queen from an exposed diagonal, preparing to redeploy it to a more active square and potentially supporting a d5 pawn break in the center. This move repositions the knight to a more active square, reinforcing the d5 outpost and preparing for potential central pawn breakthroughs or increased pressure on the queenside. This move clears the h8 square for the king, preparing to potentially reroute the rook to the g-file or defend the kingside if white advances pawns. This move advances the f-pawn, aiming to challenge black's central control and potentially open lines for white's pieces towards the kingside, a common theme in positions arising from the Sicilian Najdorf after white's early knight maneuvers. This move prepares to potentially challenge white's central pawn on e5 and supports the knight's advance, aiming to disrupt white's kingside initiative. bf3 aims to reposition the bishop to a more active diagonal, potentially supporting pawn advances on the kingside or preparing to challenge black's advanced e5 pawn. This move repositions the bishop to a more active diagonal, preparing to contest the central squares and potentially support a d5 pawn break while also defending against white's central pawn push. The king steps away from the d-file, providing a safe haven while preparing to potentially support a kingside pawn advance. This move reinforces the kingside pawn structure and prepares to contest the f-file should it open, while also preventing white's knight from easily infiltrating via g5. White's na2 repositions the knight from the edge to a more central square, preparing to support a potential kingside pawn advance and freeing the f1 square for the king, should it need to escape. This move challenges white's queenside pawn structure and aims to activate the queenside majority by potentially creating play on the a-file. This move reroutes the knight to a more active square, aiming to support the d6 pawn and potentially pressure black's queenside structure after developing the other knight. This move prepares to bring the rook to a more active square along the 7th rank, supporting a potential f5 advance and increasing pressure on white's queenside. White repositions the knight to a more active square, preparing to support a potential pawn advance on the queenside or to contest control of the central dark squares. The move 27, qb8 is a strategic repositioning, preparing to potentially reinforce the queenside or activate the queen on the b-file, aiming to create counterplay against white's centralized pieces and kingside development. This move exchanges a knight for a pawn, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines for white's pieces, though it comes at the cost of a tempo and potentially weakening white's kingside. This move prepares to challenge white's rook on the d-file, a common defensive maneuver to disrupt the opponent's centralized pieces and potentially activate the rook to a more active square. This move repositions the knight from the defensive b5 square to an active central outpost, aiming to control key squares and potentially support a queenside pawn advance or a central breakthrough. Black exchanges a bishop for a knight on a crucial diagonal, simplifying the position and removing a potentially strong attacking piece for white. This capture on e3 repositions the queen to a more active central square, immediately threatening the isolated c5 pawn and reinforcing white's queenside pressure. This move repositions the knight to a more active central square, aiming to contest white's control and potentially pressure the d4 pawn. This move, nec3, repositions the knight to a more active square, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing to potentially challenge black's control of the d5 square. This move repositions the bishop to an active diagonal and prepares to contest the c5 square. This move repositions the rook to the 3rd rank, preparing to support a potential d4-d5 pawn push or to transfer to the kingside should the need arise, while also defending the knight on c3. This move exchanges a bishop for a knight, simplifying the position and opening up the d-file for black's rook, while also creating a passed pawn on the queenside after white's recapture. This knight recapture on b5, while regaining material, exposes white's own king to potential attack from black's bishop on a6 along the long diagonal. This move prepares to contest the d-file and offers the rook for potential tactical exchanges, aiming to activate black's pieces and reduce white's central pressure. This exchange of queenside pieces simplifies the position, aiming to exploit black's slightly passive piece placement and create potential attacking opportunities on the kingside. This recapture opens the d-file for white's rook and creates a pawn majority for black on the queenside, which may be leveraged for future queenside expansion. This move establishes a strong central presence for the rook, preparing to contest the open d-file and support potential pawn advances while consolidating white's material advantage. This move initiates a pawn exchange in the center, aiming to clarify the pawn structure and potentially open lines for the rook to participate more actively on the d-file. White repositions the queen to d2, allowing the rook on d1 to become active on the open d-file and preparing to potentially challenge black's rook or advance the pawn structure. This move repositions the queen to a more active square, potentially supporting a kingside attack or preparing to contest the central files. This move activates the queen, targeting the weak light squares around black's king and preparing for potential advances on the kingside or center. This move is forced, as black must recapture the queen to avoid immediate material loss, leading to a simplified endgame where white's active pieces and control of the d-file offer a slight advantage. The rook exchange simplifies the position, leading to a favorable endgame where white's connected passed pawns on the queenside offer strong winning chances. With the queens off the board, black aims to activate the rook on the open c-file, contesting white's control and preparing to challenge the d-file. This move aims to create a safe square for the king on g2 and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside, while also potentially supporting a subsequent f5 push. The black king moves to g8, securing a safer square behind the pawn chain and preparing to potentially defend the d7 pawn or connect the rooks along the third rank. This pawn advance aims to gain space on the kingside and prepare for potential pawn pushes or a kingside attack by creating more breathing room for the pieces. With the rooks on the same file and pawns advanced on the kingside, the black king ventures out to the center, seeking safer squares and potentially aiding its rooks in future defensive or offensive maneuvers. The g5 pawn push aims to create attacking chances on the kingside by opening lines and potentially sacrificing the pawn to expose the black king. This move repositions the king to a more active central square, aiming to participate in the endgame and potentially support pawn advances or defend against black's counterplay. The king repositions to a safer square, aiming to support potential pawn advances on the kingside while also preparing for potential defensive duties in the center or queenside should the game extend. This move initiates a pawn race on the queenside, aiming to create a passed pawn before white can advance their own pawns on the kingside. This move prepares to connect the rooks by moving the king's rook off the d-file, facilitating potential central pawn breakthroughs and centralizing the rook for future action. This move aims to attack the advanced white rook on d2 and potentially create a passed pawn on the queenside. However, it leaves the b6 pawn vulnerable and doesn't address the strong white central pawn majority. This move re-establishes pressure on the a3 square, preventing black from immediately advancing their passed pawn and preparing to coordinate the rook and knight for a future central push. The knight repositions to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn majority on the queenside and potentially participate in a kingside attack or control central squares. The knight repositions to c2, a flexible square from which it can support a kingside pawn advance or swing over to the queenside to contest black's control of the a-file. This move aims to challenge white's control of the d-file and potentially reroute the rook to a more active square, but it neglects the vulnerable a4 pawn, which may become a target for white's knight. This exchange of rooks simplifies the position, bringing white closer to a favorable endgame where their active rook on d1 can exploit the open files and white's potentially advanced kingside pawns. With the queens off the board, this king move centralizes the monarch and prepares to participate in the upcoming pawn endgame, aiming to support the remaining queenside pawns. This move simplifies the position by exchanging pawns, creating a more open endgame where white's king can become more active and exploit the weak squares on the queenside. This move opens the g-file for white's rook and king to potentially exploit. while black's pawn structure is now weakened on the kingside. The knight repositions to e3 to control central squares and prepare for potential pawn advances, aiming to consolidate white's advantage in the endgame. The knight repositions to nb4 to pressure the c2 pawn and create tactical possibilities on the queenside, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure. This move aims to restrict the opponent's knight on b4, preventing it from becoming active on c2 or a2, and preparing to advance the queenside pawn structure. This move aims to reposition the knight to a more active square, potentially supporting a pawn advance or improving its defensive coverage. The king advances to g4 to support the a-pawn's potential push towards promotion and to contest the central squares in this endgame. The king's journey to the center aims to participate actively in the endgame, supporting the passed a-pawn and potentially defending against black's initiative on the queenside. The king advances to h5, seeking to become more active in the endgame and potentially support a kingside pawn advance, aiming to gain space and restrict black's pieces. The move 51, kf7, is a logical repositioning of the king, centralizing it to escape the pressure on the h-file and prepare for potential action in the endgame by activating it towards the center. The king's active journey continues, consolidating its position on the queenside while preventing black's knight from entering the territory. The king repositions to the corner, seeking safety from the open files and potential checks, while white's king advances aggressively to control more central space. nd5 aims to occupy the strong central outpost and potentially support a knight transfer to c7 or b6, while also restricting black's queen and king activity. This move aims to secure the knight on d7, preventing its capture by white's pawn and preparing for potential counterplay by reinforcing the king's defense or moving towards the center. This move activates the bishop to a more aggressive diagonal, preparing to support potential pawn advances or exploit black's somewhat passive pawn structure on the queenside. This move sacrifices the knight on b2 to gain a passed pawn on the a-file, creating immediate complications for white's king and potentially forcing concessions. This move aims to reposition the bishop to a more active square, intending to support the pawn advance and control key squares on the kingside. This move activates the knight to a central outpost, reinforcing the pawn chain and preparing to challenge white's control of the d5 square. This move executes a critical fork, winning material by attacking the opponent's king and rook simultaneously, and decisively improving white's material advantage. The king is now centralized and better protected, aiming to support the pawn majority on the queenside while the remaining rook battles for control of the important open d-file. This move repositions the bishop to a more active square, aiming to control key diagonals and prepare for potential pawn pushes on the kingside. This move, though seemingly a simple pawn advance, aims to disrupt white's coordination by forcing a decision on how to handle the new pawn chain and potentially create weaknesses around white's king. The move 58, bc6, threatens to win black's knight on d3 by attacking it with the bishop, forcing black to defend it or lose material, thus simplifying white's position towards a winning endgame.